All right, perfect. Now that everyone has had a moment or two to get in, I just want to welcome everyone and introduce myself. My name is Sandro Figueroa. I'm a junior research associate with the Highway Safety Research Center at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We are so happy to welcome you to the PBIC webinar series, where today we will be covering advancing trails to support multimodal networks and resilient infrastructure. Today, we will have a two-part presentation that covers advancing trails to support multimodal networks and resilient infrastructure. The first part is going to be a report published by PBIC in 2021 titled Advancing Trails to Support Multimodal Networks. And then the second part will be a guidebook published by the FHWA in 2023 titled Trails as Resilient Infrastructure. Our focus today will be on using the guidebook as a new foundation for trail planning, design, and management. We will conclude today's session with a Q&A for both presentations, so please use the webinar chat functions to submit your questions. Briefly, I would like to go over the bios for today's panelists and share their introductions, as we do appreciate their contributions to the work. Christopher Dowse is a community planner with the Federal Highway Administration in Washington, D.C. He has managed the Recreational Trails Program since 1992. He has managed, since 1992, transportation enhancement activities and transportation alternatives since 2003, and has assisted with the bicycle and pedestrian activities since 1992. He manages contracts for research, technology development, technical assistance, and training for trail and bicycle and pedestrian related activities. D'Angeline is a senior research associate at HSRC, specializing in pedestrian and bicycle safety. He manages research and technical assistant programs related to road safety with an emphasis on improving travel for non-motorized users. Unfortunately, Dan sends his regrets as he cannot join us today, but we do want to acknowledge his valuable contribution to the work we're covering. Jeff Kabadi is Tool Design's Trail and Greenway practice lead. He has spent more than 25 years helping communities develop healthy, sustainable communities through building networks of trails, greenways, and connecting corridors. Jeff co-authored PBIC's Trails Info Brief, Advancing Trails to Support Multimodal Networks, and oversaw the production of FHWA's Guidebook on Trails as Climate Resilient Infrastructure. Kristen Losey is a principal urban designer at Tool Design, specializing in trail planning and design. She has over 2 decades of experience with shared use paths, includes system-wide planning, feasibility studies, trail design, and construction, and the development of design guidance documents. She is a co-author of the Trails as Resilient Infrastructure Guidebook. Next, we have Stephanie Wire, who is a landscape architect in Tool Design's Boston office, who works on trails from feasibility studies and framework plans through final design and construction. She is also one of the company's climate resilience resource group leads, raising awareness of climate change mitigation and adaptation methods within Tool's work. Lastly, we have Todd McAuliffe, and he is a transportation planner with AECOM and has 20 years of experience delivering multimodal transportation planning projects for state DOTs and municipalities throughout the Southeast. In addition to his transportation work, he also has worked on environmental documentation, land use studies, and resilience and recovery plans. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. Attendees, you are in listen-only mode, but you can still communicate with us and the panelists using the Q&A pane at the bottom of the Zoom webinars window. We have built in some time at the end of today's webinar for a discussion period with our panelists, so we'll try to integrate your questions and comments. Please submit them at any time throughout the presentation. The webinar is going to be archived at www.pedbikeinfo.org/webinars. This includes a copy of the slides, which are posted now, and a video recording, which should be available by tomorrow. A follow-up email will contain more details about all of this, so please be on the lookout for that email within your inbox. This webinar is eligible for certain certificates and professional development hours. We will be providing everyone with a link to download a certificate of attendance following the completion of the post-webinar questionnaire. As always, we encourage you to check out the recorded webinars and sign up for future episodes. I'd now like to turn things over to our first panelist, Christopher Dowse, to get us started with today's presentations.
Thank you, Sandro. So I'm happy to be talking with everybody. I've only been responsible for the recreational trails program since its inception. The reason I'm talking about recreational trails program is because it is the funding source for this research. Recreational trails program is a set aside of funds from transportation alternatives. It only provides $84 million a year, but Federal Highway Administration gets a 1% ability to use 1% of the funds to support research and technical assistance. So that's primarily the way that this project was funded. But the transportation alternatives, of course, is a large source of funds, $1.5 billion for 27,000 projects since 1993, if you include the transportation enhancement activities. So this slide provides information, some very basic information about these two programs. All the information is available on our web pages. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about using Qualified Use Service and Conservation Corps to do your projects, because that can be a cost-effective method. And a lot of the corps are very much involved in doing resilience and trails projects. So look up your local youth corps and see how they can help. So what I'm going to do now is, Sandro, let's go to the next slide. As I said, this is being funded. This project that we're talking about was funded with Recreational Trails Program funds. So how have we been using our administrative funds? We have our publications page, which includes multiple links to many U.S. Forest Service trail reports. That's where a lot of the funding has gone. We've also provided funding to American Trails and some other trail organizations to do trail training. We recently put out a Rails with Trails 3 years ago already, a Rails with Trails best practices and lesson learned book. In fact, there's a new version of that on engineering design, which Jeff will probably mention at the end. We've done research on e-bikes, and our Federal Lands Office has also done research on e-bikes. We completed a report on tribal development of trails and other dedicated pedestrian and bicycle transportation. We did first a briefing paper on trails and resilience, the role of trails in climate resilience. That was a background paper that then fed into the Trails as Resilient Infrastructure Guidebook that we will be talking about. And I mentioned the ongoing research on Rails with Trails design and engineering, and we have other research that we are going to be working on. The point behind a lot of today's webinar is trails are an integral part of a safe, accessible, equitable, and comfortable multimodal transportation network. If a facility is not accessible, it's not safe. If it's not equitable, it's not safe. If it's not safe, it's not equitable. If it's not safe, it's not accessible. So we also need to have a system where everybody can feel and be safe and comfortable. So with that introduction, Sandro, I believe that is time for you to come back and take over.
Perfect. Thank you so much for providing that background to us, Christopher. I think it really helps provide the context needed to really jump into today's presentation. That being said, I'm going to transition the presentation over to Jeff Gabati with Tool Design. I do want to take this moment while we're transitioning the slides to provide everyone with a reminder that if you do go to www.pedbikeinfo.org/webinars, you will have access to our slides and the slide deck that we are using today. With that being said, I'm going to turn off my camera and mute my microphone and let the experts get into it.
Thanks so much, Sandro, and thank you, Christopher. The info brief provides a high-level look at the new research, the precedents, and strategies for trail development. Those items include the various health and environmental, economic, and social benefits of trails, the community engagement techniques, planning strategies, policy tools, and regulatory strategies for jurisdictions to implement trails, and a summary of the latest trails research and highlights of noteworthy trail projects around the country. So we took a little bit of a fresh look, although it is a high-level look overall for the info brief in particular. As is the case in many of the work that is done in our trails community, many of the materials and reports and good ideas were drawn from a variety of national organizations, state agencies, and local communities that have been successful trail advocates and builders for years. And we thank you all for that good information. This resource has guidance for communities starting out building the case for trails. It has resources for communities that have been doing this for a while and have a fairly mature network, and as well as for communities that have had lots of success and really want to move on to the next level of a world-class trail system. It also covers topics we all can use: equity considerations, regulatory strategies to coordinate land use to both meet and challenge of urban and suburban areas, funding opportunities. It provides some trail evaluations related to counting systems and direct monitoring, understanding the value of that, and knowing who and when and where folks are using your facilities, and trail activation through communication and programming. As we all know, there are numerous benefits of trails, and we commonly cite these in our work to advance and promote their development. It can be valuable to compile and cite research that backs up these claims, and we did just that with the PBIC info brief. You'll find references in the brief to 33 studies and research papers that document hard evidence, backing up these claims and providing a solid foundation of research for why trails can help support community goals. For example, one study documented increases in commuting by bicycle after a trail in Minneapolis linked residential areas with major employment centers. Another study revealed trails to be one of the most cost-efficient interventions for increasing physical activity and improving health. Our intent was to compile a series of empirical research in a way that was readily available for the trails community to use, and we think we've done that. Next, we're going to touch on three key components that are covered in the info brief that are largely changing the way trail communities do their work. These changes are being driven by societal needs, in one case in the form of equitable trail development. They're being driven by physical and technological challenges in the form of multimodal network connectivity. And they're being driven in the rapidly changing climate in the form of climate resilient trails. And we focus on these in the guide, and we'll be talking more about climate resilient trails here in a moment. For each of these areas, the info brief has sections that focus on equity and how to fairly distribute the many benefits of trails. It also has guidance for all types of communities on addressing increasing demand for trails as transportation and integrating trails as part of a multimodal transportation network. And there is an introduction on developing trails that are resilient to the effects of climate change and maximizing the environmental benefits of trails. Equity and inclusion. Developing an effective approach to equitable trail development starts with recognizing the issues. There are a lack of trail resources in underserved communities, and there are gaps in trail networks that typically exclude these neighborhoods. One section of our research, according to that cited in the brief, the people of color are less likely to be trail users than white people. And as practitioners, we found a relatively simple way, but important way to increase usage through the implementation of wayfinding. Additionally, without good planning and community involvement at the outset, investments in trails and other green spaces can lead to rising property values and thus displacement. There are a whole host of things we are thinking about in terms of equity that we weren't focusing on in the past. The communities we work and play in deserve these new approaches for creating and maintaining meaningful partnerships and cultivating social inclusion. The brief provides a summary of policy tools for resisting displacement and green gentrification. Some of those tools are listed here. There's also an excellent review of research conducted in Detroit that looked at the development of the Joe Louis Greenway, a phenomenal 31-mile trail loop around the city of Detroit. From the perspective of environmental justice, the researchers created a green reparations model, and it's helping to chart a new path of redevelopment for that city. Go visit Detroit if you get a chance. Wonderful. Multimodal network. It's a multimodal world and becoming more so, even to the point I recently noticed on The new street mix cross sections even has a magic carpet option, which is really the option I would like to use in the future. While we still use trails for recreation, they can provide key connections to everyday destinations. We're shifting away from standalone recreational trails towards using trails as strategic links to a larger network that serves both recreation and transportation purposes. Trails are increasingly needed for all modes of off-street travel. And trails are being used differently than long ago, and that's dictating how we need to build trails differently. For example, we need wider pathways. Sometimes we need separated facilities or co-location with utilities and other linear corridors. Similar to our approach with equity, we need to focus on the user in this new landscape of trail development. To build a multimodal network, we need to understand the value of small local connectors to create access to miles of trails networks or previously inaccessible destinations. Examples like accessing a gated community or cul-de-sac, a bridge over a railroad track, or a highway underpass. When we effectively supplement existing transportation options, intermodal connectivity can improve livability and expand the reach of our multimodal travelers, especially in areas where dense trail and transit networks intersect. The brief also introduces the topic of resiliency, identifying how climate change has had an immense impact on trails through erosion and fire, high temperatures, frequent and more expensive maintenance needs. It provides an overview of how trails can play a significant role in mitigating climate change by acting as a carbon sink, also by shifting vehicle trips to non-motorized trips, and how trails can also help regions adapt to changing environmental conditions by managing stormwater through green and blue infrastructure and acting as evacuation routes and to accommodate emergency response vehicles and response operations. The intention for the guidebook was to shine a light on these issues and of climate resiliency and adaptation and mitigation, and emphasize how these are longer-term items to plan for. They're not longer-term items to plan for, but to plan for right now. All issues we will now review in more detail in the second part of the presentation on trails as climate resilient infrastructure. Now we'll get a deeper dive into the review of the findings of the new FHWA guidebook on trails as resilient infrastructure. We'll be discussing how trails can be planned and designed to prepare for the impacts of climate change and how trails can be part of the climate solution. As Christopher mentioned earlier on, the guidebook grew out of a white paper by the U.S. Department of Transportation Volpe Center, which focused on sustainability and equity, and it was developed in support of the Recreation Trails program. It examines how trail planners, designers, and managers are addressing climate change and trails. The white paper highlighted the lack of comprehensive resources about the topic, and thus the guidebook project was born. The guidebook identifies best practices in context-based trail planning, design, siting, construction, management, and maintenance for all kinds of trails from urban to natural surface. The guidebook is available currently on the FHWA website, and our team will provide a link in the chat for easy access during the meeting. The presentation topics that will follow or focus on today include climate impacts, the adaptation, trails for climate mitigation, emergency response, and then the final piece will be taking action on policy and implementation. I'll now turn it over to Kristen to discuss the climate impacts to trails. Kristen?
Thanks, Jeff. Across all regions and types of trails, climate change threatens to reduce access to trails, to impact users' comfort and experiences, and to force trail operators to adapt their construction and maintenance programs. In terms of trails themselves, climate change is both results in both physical and economic changes, often with lasting damage. In this section, I'll walk through a few of the ways climate change is affecting trails. Next slide. So a first step in creating resilient trails is understanding the vulnerability of a trail or trail system, which can vary by region and setting. There's a lot of data out there and research to be found. This is a screenshot from a tool called the Climate Explorer That's an excellent one that allows you to look up climate impacts by specific area. The guidebook specifically explores how trails are being affected by climate change, and it reviews research, design guidelines, case studies, and best practices. And it reviews common event types and risk factors to help trail planners, designers, and managers mitigate and plan for climate change impacts. Next slide. I'll start with severe storm events. As we all know and have seen, climate change has brought more frequent storms, heavier precipitation, early snow melt, and more destructive hurricanes. Many trails and greenways are located along rivers, streams, and coastlines, and that makes them particularly vulnerable to flooding, both seasonal but tidal and permanent. And flooding can impact trails in multiple ways. First, it can deposit sediment. Oh, can you go back, please? Sediment and debris over trails, as in the picture in the left, and water itself, either through velocity or standing water, can damage trail surfacing, paving. And then on a more drastic scale, flooding can undercut the base course of the trail surface, blow out culverts, and damage structures, as you see in the example on the right. The result in terms of maintenance is increased frequency the increased frequency and intensity of flooding creates a big maintenance burden for agencies. And that includes both short and long-term maintenance for cleanup and repairs, as well as the work of temporary and permanent closures for trail user safety. Next slide. Sea level rise has similar impacts to flooding, with the added impact of erosion and inundation that shrinks shorelines over time. This is an image of the Mill Valley Sausalito Path in Marin County, California, which is part of the Bay Trail, which will eventually circle the entire San Francisco Bay. This part of the path passes through a marsh preserve and thus floods several times a year during both king tides and high tides with storm surges, as you can see in the picture. And trail managers have recognized that parts of the trail will eventually be displaced permanently by rising sea level. I think if you hit next, it'll activate some additional images. So this has prompted multiple agencies to come together to evaluate and develop a plan to both realign and elevate the path by several feet where it passes through the marsh in response to sea level rise. Next slide. Fire has always shaped natural landscapes, particularly in the Western US, through both seasonal wildfires and intentional burns by Native Americans. But climate change has made the organic matter in forests much drier, and along with urbanization and fire suppression policies, wildfires are now more frequent, more intense, and expand across the typical seasons, and are thus more devastating to both urban and rural areas. On both the east and west coasts of the US, fire frequency has doubled in the last 10 years and quadrupled in the Great Plains area. In addition to the damage to trails, can you go back, please? And trail structures and amenities like bridges and benches, fire impacts unfold over seasons and years throughout the surrounding landscape. The damage to trees and vegetation is most obvious, but along with that are the critical root systems of the plants and trees, which hold the soil in place, makes erosion a secondary hazard, and when rainstorms that follow, it carries the loosened soil and sediment into the water systems, creating downstream impacts to water quality. Now you can go forward, next slide. Extreme heat events such as the heat wave of 2021 in Washington State, where this picture was taken, resulted in 100 heat-related deaths throughout the state. And these are becoming increasingly common with climate change. So the human health impacts are foremost. They limit people's ability to use trails safely and make it dangerous to use them when temperatures are very high. But heat also results in damage to trails, notably trail surfacing, and particularly asphalt, which many trails are paved in, as you can see in this picture, and not to mention vegetation. You may have read that interesting article in the New York Times last year that talked about how hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, which goes from Canada to Mexico, has become much more perilous and difficult due to the lack of drinking water sources, hazard trees, and other heat-related impacts to the landscape. Next slide. The vernal window, or the winter to spring transition, is a key period for seasonally snow-covered forested ecosystems. Think shorter winters and earlier and longer springs. Scientists project that climate change will lengthen the vernal window significantly over the next 80 years. And what this results in is an expansion and contraction of the range of plants and animals. The shifting window instigates shifts in the plant, animal, and insect communities when the water, when the temperatures, when the food resources that they need are no longer available at the elevation they live at. This makes them more vulnerable to pests and diseases. And for trails, this may mean failing vegetation, invasive species, or even more pests that create nuisance and health hazards to people. And perhaps the most visible impact of the vernal window shift is longer mud seasons, which can damage trail surfacing through extended drainage cycles, erosion, and trampled vegetation when people divert off primary trails. Next slide. And finally, how does climate impact affect current and potential trail users? Climate change impacts everyone, but particularly vulnerable communities. Vulnerable communities bear a higher health and economic burdens with climate change. For example, in California's San Joaquin Central Valley, where this picture was taken, high temperatures and poor air quality impact people who use trails for transportation, as you can see in this picture. And then, as Jeff touched on before, the development of new trails can create displacement through gentrification, through green gentrification, and people relocating to escape or avoid climate change or disaster. So these are really complex issues that need to be addressed in all stages of planning for climate resilient trails. Next slide. So we're going to break here for our first question. A poll with the question should pop open in a separate window. There it is. So please share with us what's the top affecting trails in your community. I believe the results should be coming up in a moment. I'm not seeing them. Are others seeing results? Good. So getting a lot of responses. Great. Okay. So we'll see the results in just a moment. Right, so heat, smoke, and poor air quality are coming in high, and flooding and king tides. Great. Excellent. Yes, flooding looks to be the winner. The winner, the loser. All right. We can move on. Next slide. So now that we've covered the risks at a high level, we're going to talk about planning, design, and management solutions for climate change impacts to trails. And I want to mention that the guidebook assumes sustainable design and construction practices are given. The guidebook is really intended to supplement those practices for which there are ample resources and to specifically address climate impacts to trails. So in this section, my colleague Stephanie and I will share a couple of examples from case studies to show how trails have been adapted in response to climate impacts. Next slide. So grading and drainage are key tools for managing storm surges and sea level rise. And obviously the systemic approach of minimizing impacts to wetlands, streams, stream restoration, using green stormwater infrastructure, as you see in the picture on the right, are really important at a systemic level. But there are a lot of climate adaptive construction methods for trails at the site scale that can be used, including specialized structures and designs. The image on the left is an example from the Houston bayous. The area experienced massive flooding and hurricanes in 2016 to 2020. And they recognized that it was going to be a continuous issue, especially with rapid urbanization and the reduction of permeable surfaces to soak up that stormwater. So the city really embraced the bayous as a way to improve the area's physical, environmental, and economic resilience. Houston Parks Board, the managing agency, worked to remove structures from the floodway. They expanded stormwater detention and infiltration and developed trails to provide recreational, transportation, and community health benefits. They also developed a climate adaptive cross-section for their trails. And if you hit next, I think that a little image will come up perfect. They developed what they call a turn down, which is kind of a footing, which varies in length from 18 to 36 inches to protect the underside of the trails, which were being washed out by flooding. So it stabilizes the surface of the trail when there's standing water. They also changed the trail surfacing from asphalt to concrete and beefed it up to 6 inches to withstand the flooding. Next slide. Planning and managing trail corridors for fire. So this is a picture from the Bear Creek Greenway, which is located in the Rogue River Valley in Southern Oregon. And in 2020, the Almeida fire hit the area and it burned over 3,000 acres, destroyed over 2,500 residences, and damaged a significant portion of the trail. And what happened is that the trail, which runs along Bear Creek, was bordered by a lot of flammable invasive vegetation, and that allowed the fire to spread very quickly through the understory and get up into the canopy of the native riparian vegetation along the creek. And this is a really important salmon-bearing stream in the area. So the damage from the fire had a potential catastrophic impact to the water quality and salmon impact. So the managing agencies quickly mobilized to address the water quality risk by mapping the damage, and that allowed them to prioritize areas for remedial seeding and treatments to hold the soil in place. And I love this image because one of the clever things they did was they needed to quickly find labor to do all this work. And so they tapped the community and the cross-country teams trained along the trail. So they were able to pull those students into these community service projects and help with this kind of rapid response. Since that time, local and regional governments have acknowledged that warmer, drier climate means larger fires. And so they've come together to develop a multidisciplinary management plan that includes fire, police, and natural resources staff. And they've developed this more active approach to managing invasive vegetation along the corridor to suppress fuel and prevent future fires. And the image on the left shows how they're managing the fuel and creating a fuel break to prevent fires from getting to the street. Next slide. I turn it over to Stephanie.
Thank you. Again, Stephanie Wire. So designing for heat, which many of you responded as a growing issue. I think for many of you, probably planting trees along trails seems like an obvious solution and a good one. In this case, with the CV link, this is a trail located in a desert. So it follows the flood control channel for the Whitewater River in the Coachella Valley, and it'll be, once it's finished, a 40-mile network of trails with, I think, crossing 6 communities and 3 tribal jurisdictions. It's planned to be a very high capacity use pathway and an important one for all of these communities. However, being in a valley or in a desert, it is in the summer frequently reaching 100 degrees, sometimes 120 degrees. So there's a huge need to protect public safety. It also, because it's running along a flood control channel, is needing to provide access for heavy maintenance vehicles. So you can see in the picture, it's a wide trail, 14 feet wide, with some decomposed aggregate on the side for walkers and runners. But this trail is 8 inches thick. The concrete, Kristen already mentioned that asphalt is very brittle in the heat, so concrete withstanding those high desert temperatures. And then while these are very nice, fancy shade structures, I think shade structures are a great solution to be thinking about for your trails. These are actually angled so that they take advantage of kind of stronger summer sun. And then last, you can see there's water fountains provided as well. Next slide. So, behind every one of these case studies is a lot of management and planning, and management is just increasingly important to be adaptive. When it comes to climate, many of you are probably already seeing increased maintenance burdens. Desirable times to be out on trails are shifting with warmer temperatures. You're seeing more closures. Those in natural surface management are dealing with those increasingly longer mud seasons. You'd see the picture on the right is just some communication signage about trying to prevent people from using trails during mud season. And education is becoming a big part of management. It's increasingly important to know what preparatory actions to take, such as clearing out drainage structures before events, and to plan for additional staffing or volunteers, as Kristen was saying, to help deal with hazardous conditions or needing to prep for those. And then back to the communications, that is just critical, not only with staff and volunteers, but with the public, using all tools available, websites, social media, your listservs, text alerts, and there are several trails that are installing warning signals on trails, flashing lights that will come with flooding, but also using a field team, whether that's volunteers or paid trail rangers who can conduct post-storm sweeps and lead educational programs and try to educate people about what the trail needs are and why things are closed, and making it just very clear and transparent. Next slide. So with management as the planning and maintenance as the follow-up, maintenance is first and foremost about the safety of users and then about the protection of assets. So maintenance should really be prioritizing after an event, something that is going to affect somebody's safety. Vegetation is one that Kristen already mentioned when it comes to fire. This is a big maintenance topic addressed in the guide. Thinking about vegetation in ways that can prevent fire or prevent fire from spreading, but also thinking about vegetation in ways to prevent carbon emissions. And the flip side of vegetation is a lot of trails are mowed. And thinking about reducing maintenance burdens can include reducing your mowing. So planning for lower mowing trails, using vegetation that doesn't require mowing, or you can see these examples, allowing vegetation to grow up directly on the shoulders of trails. Next is the trail surface, which of course is very vulnerable to flooding and heat, and needing to plan out those timelines for resurfacing or understanding when it's really necessary to address surface problems such as potholes. Again, that comes back to public safety. Structures include boardwalks, bridges, walls, and keeping those clear, keeping those stable. Lastly, the drainage, which includes various culverts, just going back to keeping those cleared out, designing trails for drainage, and that's kind of the next key point, is designing for maintenance, understanding materials, understanding the durability of those, and understanding how to both grade and use materials so that trails drain and you don't get ponding problems. The last aspect of maintenance is really more frequent inspections. Ideally, using inspections to address the problems that come up. Go to the next slide. So our next question, what steps has your community or organization taken to address climate impact to trails? Drum roll. All right, so we've got a lot of strong response on gathered data, pursuing, understanding those current issues or risks, conducting studies, and adapting the design of the trail or trail features. I'd love to hear from people as to what they've been doing. All right, let's move on. The next slide. So trails as a climate solution or a climate mitigation. You can go to the next slide. Whereas the previous section was talking about trails adapting for climate. This is really flipping it on its head and talking about trails as part of climate solution and mitigating or reducing carbon emissions. Trails are an obvious way to reduce transportation related emissions, particularly if we can think about them in terms of a network and really integrating trails into your overall transportation system, connecting to everything from transit to driving, and just giving people the opportunity to use trails as shorter trip options. So under 5 miles, or with e-bikes, we can increase that distance somewhat. And make active transportation more of a daily transportation option. The Oak Leaf Trail in Milwaukee is featured on the right. It's a multi-use system that has over 135 miles connecting through its metro area. And you can see the thicker lines are showing branch lines, and those run in a number of different directions, but they meet a lot of smaller municipal trails. And so these all don't even really need to be, a trail corridor. There can be just connections through on streets from one trail path to another. So the extent of the network can really help make active transportation a choice over driving and reduces carbon emissions. Next slide. But beyond carbon emissions and reduction, we want to think about trails beyond the paved path, and trails as green infrastructure. Trails can serve within wider corridors. This is a Gamble's Mill Eco Corridor in Richmond, Virginia, which is a stream restoration project. It was actually a very eroded stream. And the project was started to resolve some of the stream's issues. The trail was something that was a popular idea with the community. There was a walking path here previously, but integrating the two has really created this great public resource where there are little educational rooms along the side, and the trail is able to flood not just its channel, but that whole wider area you're seeing, or the stream rather, and it can flood all the way up to the trail. So the trail is designed to be able to handle some drainage across it, and has box culverts where the stream is occasionally crossing under. So thinking about trails beyond the path surface alone and how they can work within green infrastructure or low impact development is a great way to think about overall climate mitigation. Next slide. And then lastly, bringing it back to equity and what does that mean in trail work? Kristen talked about issues, or Kristen and Jeff, related to trails and climate. As much as trails can perpetuate inequities, how we pursue policies, planning, and design is a big part of pursuing equity in general. And on the planning side, this can mean aiming to enhance trails where they're needed most through your long-term planning projects. So there are many examples of prioritization plans and tools such as the Portland, Oregon Metro Trails that's featured on the slide. And they consider equity and many consider climate resilience as a criteria for prioritization of trail alignments and funding. That's long range. Within any planning project and down to master planning for a particular trail, the process matters as much as the outcome. All stages of planning and design, at all stages, inclusive processes involve meaningful collaboration with community and developing long-term partnerships. And it's really those inclusive processes that raise people's confidence in the trail as something they can belong to, and that is a part of their community and is a valuable resource for them. It also helps to garner long-term stewardship. And another part of that is trail organizations providing mutual support, or trail planners providing mutual support to partners, and helping them develop their own capacity and leadership so that they can continue to drive stewardship of the trail. On the design side, focus on equity can span a range of things from accessible routes, designing for accessible paths across the board, and navigation for people with low vision, the blind, designing more intentionally for women. You could consult some design resources, but really collaborating with women's recreational groups and understanding some of the things they're focused on or the challenge that they're facing, and even just working with women to design or to help program out trail spaces can really help. Incorporating art with consideration for who makes it, who it represents, and how it represents them. Art is a great way to run a process that people can really be involved in and perpetuate messages about the trail over time. A really great way, or a very cost-effective means of giving a trail identity. And as Jeff was saying earlier, also creating wayfinding. Art can certainly be worked into wayfinding and used along path corridors throughout. Lastly, realize that trails are viewed as social and gathering resources for communities. They're not just places to pass through. And so designing for that use. Considering communications, again, it's all about communications and what do marketing materials and websites say as well. What do they use in their graphics and language? That can really lead to a lot more inclusivity as well. So I think next slide, we maybe have one more question, right? So what would help you better plan for the impacts of climate change in the context of trails? Aside from funding, we know funding is an issue. And hopefully data is not one of these selected ones. It sounded like everybody had the data. We'll see. All right, so the top ones, understanding your region's vulnerabilities, And then specific design guidance. There's a lot of great design guidance out there for trails. Jeff mentioned the Joe Louis Greenway in Detroit. That is an excellent one. Most states, I think, have some pretty great featured trails to learn from. And then, yeah, I should say data on trail usage and user needs. That is different from understanding those climate impacts and knowing how people are adapting their timing on trails. Very important. So I think with that, I am passing it. Yes, to Todd McAuliffe for Trails for Emergency Response.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk about trails, using trails as in emergency management. And it's probably safe to say that most people don't consider trails when they think of emergency response planning. They think of, things like recreation and maybe the transportation benefits of trails. But the guidebook includes a section on how trails can provide emergency support during natural and other disasters. And a good example of trails as part of an emergency response is the Mount Vernon Trail, which is next to the Pentagon, and which was used as an evacuation route for Pentagon workers during the September 11th terrorist attacks. Next slide, please. So it's important to think of trails just beyond their recreational uses and consider that they can provide a redundant network of routes for evacuation, rescue, or other emergency response operations. I'm going to be giving a couple examples shortly on where and how trails have been used for emergency response in the past. Trails can provide access to and from community lifelines. We went ahead the last slide, please. Trails can provide access to and from community lifelines, which is a term that FEMA uses in the FEMA National Response Framework, and can be described basically as government and business functions or services that are essential to human health, safety, and economic security. So there are things like food and water, health and medical services, and internet and interconnected trail system can support community lifelines during and after emergencies by providing additional and redundant access to those locations. Okay, next slide, please. Trails can also help with emergency response planning, particularly if they are incorporated into emergency response plans and coordinated between state, regional, and local officials. So when we talk about including trails in emergency response planning, you should consider new trail developments or where new trails are going to be located, trends in trail use, how is your trail being used and when, and emerging threats from climate change. And a good practice is to coordinate your trail planning with your emergency management response teams, because if you do that, you can get input on where to locate emergency trail access points and how to accommodate emergency vehicle access. And that way trails could be used for search and rescue operations. Even a trail that's a natural surface trail can be used for search and rescue operation through the use of ATVs. And then evacuation planning is also discussed in the guidebook. That the terrorist attacks on September 11th and the evacuation of New Orleans during Katrina revealed the need to think about how to manage large volumes of people walking during urban evacuations. Multi-use trails could be used as key corridors for the evacuation of people walking, bicycling, or rolling, because walking may be the most efficient way to get people out of harm's way. And examples cited in the guidebook include the evacuations in New York during Hurricane Sandy, where trails were used for bicycle and pedestrian networks, were provided critical redundancy and saw an increase in use for essential trips while subway tunnels were flooded. And another example where emergency evacuation planning has been incorporated is in Berkeley, California, where concrete steps and handrails were added to pedestrian pathways as part of a FEMA grant to improve evacuation access for residents and emergency responders during wildfires. Next slide, please. So in terms of emergency operations and management, the guidebook recommends creating a clear emergency operation plan with specific procedures for different types of emergencies and having trained professionals available to carry out the emergency operations. It also discusses communications, and having uninterrupted communications is crucial in any emergency operation procedure. This can include using multiple technologies to make sure there are redundant and backup communications throughout the emergency response. And also suggests using things like solar powered charging stations along the trails. One final note on operations and management that the guidebook discusses is using any available monitoring data on trail use and incorporating it into emergency planning. For example, behavior mapping software tools can be used to visualize usage data to identify popular destinations, heavily trafficked trails, and identify recurring trail issues to aid in trail planning. Monitoring data can also play a role in where emergency response planning should be focused. And the guidebook uses an example of the Appalachian Trail usage data from Ringro's web map, and includes some cool images that highlight the density of users during the 4 seasons. And I'm showing some similar snapshots here from February, April, and July. You can kind of see the density of trail users moving north through the season. Next slide. So we wanted to highlight one example of incorporating emergency access and trail planning. This is in Paradise, California. And as you may recall, in 2018, a fire referred to as the Camp Fire destroyed nearly 95% of the buildings in the town and resulted in $16.5 billion in damage. And it also, I guess, most importantly and sadly, resulted in 85 fatalities. So at the time of the fire, the town had a 5.25 mile long trail called the Yellowstone Kelly Heritage Trail, which bisected the town and served as an ad hoc evacuation and emergency response route during the fire. But the town also experienced traffic jams and vehicle crashes during the fire, which impaired evacuations, and the fire also exposed a lack of ingress and egress routes in the town. Following the fire in 2019, the town prepared a long-term recovery plan. And among the emergency preparedness projects identified in the plan was an interconnected path system along main ingress and egress routes, which the town identified as a Tier 1 priority. These paths would focus on providing safety, connectivity, and health benefits, but they would also focus on increasing potential capacity for first responders. The first path was completed in 2022, although that path was funded by a pre-fire Caltrans grant. And additional multi-use paths were identified in 2022 in the Transportation Master Plan. And in total, the network is planned to be 43 miles in length. The paths are planned to be 10 feet wide with 2 feet wide shoulders. Next slide, please. So I just want to include a quick word regarding equity emergency management and emergency response planning and management for trails, which the guidebook includes and talks about. Emergency planning should consider vulnerable populations, and in particular individuals with access and functional needs, as those individuals have the highest mortality rates during emergencies and disasters. So guidelines to strengthen emergency response for vulnerable populations include evacuation planning for vulnerable populations. Local governments should consider identifying individuals with disabilities through the creation of disaster assistance registries and identifying designated pickup locations. Universal design standards should incorporate, trail planning should incorporate multiple language translations within trail signage and virtual platforms that are accessible to all user groups. Trail access is important is an important issue for trail planning and development more broadly, but it is also critical to emergency response planning. Public transportation links should be considered as part of trail access. And then funding allocation. Funds should be distributed in a way that supports community members of all abilities. So on my next slide, I have a question. The group should be a very simple yes or no. Be interesting to see what people say. Okay, not sure is the runaway winner, but it looks like people are not. Hopefully the guidebook can help people maybe transition to including emergency planning in their trail planning going forward. So interesting. Okay. With that, I'm going to give it back to Jeff to talk about taking action.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate that. This is the last section of the presentation before we get into questions from the audience. So with all the information just presented, the last step is to talk about action and process and how incorporating resilience can happen at any and every stage of trail development. The guidebook was developed with the sort of practical application in mind. Here we have the strategies the guidebook includes for planning, design, and construction, management and maintenance of trails. And for example, at the planning level, we think that long-range prioritization of trail projects and how and which would serve community or regional resiliency goals. For individual trail projects, we really need to identify resiliency as a goal with a clear framework for how resiliency will be pursued. And importantly, and this really applies across all stages, climate resilient trails really should be interwoven into social resilience and into developing equitable transportation networks. Trails really aren't part of the resilient infrastructure if they're not. And before we move on to take some of your questions, here are a few tips for resilient trails to consider. They range from long-term community resilience planning to vegetation management to adding amenities for safety and vulnerable users. Our challenge as a trail building community and partners is to really continue to expand on this list and make it as useful for trail building now. As we all know, these issues are present and not future issues. So for our final audience question, we acknowledge that this report was the first attempt to bring together a state of the practice on this topic. And as with most research projects, the findings we uncover often lead to more questions and a need for continued research. So please let us know what you think are the most urgent needs for additional research. Seems like we should have the Jeopardy theme song on right about now.
Copyright infringement.
Still. The presentation team also understands that, like, we gave you a set of responses, multiple choice, and we realize there's other responses that are possible probably in all these questions. So please relate that to us either during discussion today or afterwards, so you'll have a chance to correspond. All right, so the winner is which funding sources can be leveraged to advance, and that is no surprise at all. We do talk about funding sources. Luckily, most of the new, especially the federal legislation that's coming out, is a little more friendlier to trails in every aspect, and certainly in the climate resiliency aspect. So there's certainly information there. We need a wider scan of the long-term sort of practical effects. A lot of the case studies we reviewed as we were doing the work, we were realizing they were in the process of being implemented. So it was hard to sort of measure the impact of that implementation. So the expectation is in a few years, we'll be able to do that with more projects across the country. So, thanks everyone for those responses. And we'll move on to the final slide. So while this guidebook presents a collection of valuable current practice and research for practical use, it really should be considered as a starting point for the subject. We need to continue to learn from and share on-the-ground experience, and it really is sort of the key to adapting trails to our communities in a rapidly changing climate. And with that, we'd like to really just open it up to a discussion or any questions or comments folks have that come in during the presentation. And we'll go back to our full panel at this point.
Perfect. I just want to take a moment to say thank you to all our panelists. Awesome presentation for us today. I do know we have a few questions, so I think let's go ahead and jump right into the ones that we had trickling in as the presentation went on. I think notably we had a couple questions regarding equity and how you would tackle trails and equity as a key priority. Do you all have any more insights on the best practices to help communities ensure equitable strategies and trail development? I know there was a specific point I brought up about trail development and displacement. So if anyone wants to take a first attempt at answering that question, that'd be great.
Well, I can give a start, and I think both the info brief and the resiliency guidebook really do create provide a framework and some good practical examples of how to develop that equity framework and then implement it throughout your project. I think there's been great additional resources from American Trails and Rails to Trails Conservancy and other groups that you can tap into as good practical resources as well. The example I gave on the Joe Louis Greenway, it's mostly because I just love that project and we were involved in it, and I saw the beginnings of it. And the work that was done by the local organization that was part of a consulting group when they did the framework plan was phenomenal. They took the extra time and went into the communities and asked folks that had just been through basically a citywide bankruptcy, what does your neighborhood now need in terms of community amenities to sort of help rebuild and redevelop your area. And in some cases, the responses were as simple as we need a place to plant a flower bed, or we'd like a place to come and just picnic for the afternoon. And we see this trail and it's some of the connecting pathways as a vehicle for that. So there's no substitute for getting out into the community face to face and asking people what's important to them. I don't know if anyone else wants to respond.
Perfect. I really appreciate you taking the time to direct our sort of audience to the different resources and then how the guidebook can be used to guide their decision making when it comes to equity and trail development. I think it's very helpful. The Joe Louis Greenway is an excellent example to look at. Next, I think we have a good question for Todd here. It has to do with emergency access points. This specific question is asking if you could talk to how you increase these access points along private property when it comes to emergency response and trail use.
I think it would start with coordinating with your local emergency response teams to find out what types of contacts they have within the community, or to see how they handle that situation for other reasons beyond just accessing a trail, for example. I think that'd be a good place to start.
So I just have a fun addition to that, if I may, Sandro. I recently presented a portion of this presentation to the Transportation Research Board conference. And when you mentioned private property, one of the research studies I saw while I was there, it was a part of the larger panel presentation I was involved with, was they were doing research on whether it was possible and what impact it would have to access people's private vehicles for emergency management and moving people out of an area. Could they get permission from private vehicle owners of those that were automated? And could they get access to those automated cars to be able to serve as delivery vehicles for folks to get out of their community? I thought it was fascinating. So I think that particular field is like, we need to get creative, and the sky's the limit, and we need to think about all of the resources that are available to us to get our communities to safety.
Perfect. Thanks for that added insight to the question. I think now I have a question that Stephanie, you might be able to tackle. It has to do with trail of development in existing natural areas. I know that some people have questions about like the disturbance of natural areas in relation to tidal and shoreline flooding, and then also in regard to like where soil is unstable. So yeah.
Yeah, the questions about how you balance that disturbance. Well, I mean, one thing that we do here at Tool is we do feasibility studies, and this can be formal or they can be more informal, where you actually walk a potential alignment or alignments if you don't really know where you're headed yet, and really just kind of inventory what's happening along the trail. Where could you maybe make choices that help move people off of some more vulnerable piece of the landscape? I'm thinking in terms of shorelines. I think ultimately, when it comes down to shorelines, I know there's kind of a big philosophical debate happening. We know in Newport, Rhode Island, they have the famous cliff walk, and it's collapsing in pieces, and they are considering having to push parts of that cliff walk out into the neighborhood, or just continue to rebuild. So I think it also just comes down to planning, and it comes down to considering some of your funding, and do you have the ability to keep maintaining and rebuilding in a very vulnerable area?
I can add a thing or two. So I presented this material last spring with someone from the East Bay Regional Parks District in the San Francisco Bay Area. And they talked about how, it can be expensive to relocate a trail, right? But if you are able to partner with an agency that wants to do a restoration of a natural area, that you can combine forces, energy, money. So I think thinking kind of beyond your own agency and getting project partners to think about the bigger network, whether that's the street network or the natural network, and how you can work together to meet goals. So
Perfect. I appreciate that. And then I think next we'll go ahead and move on to a question regarding like urban trail development. One of the questions has to do with e-scooters and e-bikes, and sort of how you have that integrated within the info brief and the guidebook, and if there are specific insights as to navigating those different modes of transportation within the guidebook.
So I can start related to the info brief. It is covered in a sort of summary way on the info brief with a couple examples looking at the Pinellas Trail. You know, as a trails community, we need to embrace as many modes as possible. And there's going to be, as technology advances, there's going to be new ways for folks to use and play on trails. And there's this huge national experiment going on right now in terms of figuring out the balance of policy and program and infrastructure that's necessary to accommodate this new type of technology, the micromobility, and making sure that it connects to our transportation system. So it's covered in some of the research associated with the Trails Info brief itself. And it's also, there's some practical examples and some strategies, I believe, built into the guidebook as well. A lot of what I have seen, and some of that's reflected in the info guide, is policy related and experimentation at the local level in terms of monitoring the speed volumes, in some cases separating uses between bicyclists and e-scooters and walkers and joggers and runners. So there's infrastructure related solutions as well as policy related solutions that really need to be brought to bear.
I want to touch on that too, since I know Hagen. Question comes from a Federal Highway Administration employee who is a wonderful person. So it actually, the e-scooters was actually not a focus of this project. This project is more for dealing with climate issues, for trail resilience, for emergency management. So Hagen is fully aware, and the link that I put in one of the questions earlier for all the Federal Highway for the Recreational Trails Program publications, that has a link to two studies that we have on e-bikes. So that information is available. And of course, Hagen's involved with that too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I think next I want to move on to a topic area that has come up in a few different ways. It relates to personal security along trails. So I know one of the questions includes the context that while you're on trails and utilizing trails, you have to be vigilant of your surroundings. I was wondering if this comes up in any way within the guidebook, and then, you know, what those infrastructure needs sort of are for areas that have low light or decreased visibility when utilizing the trail. And then I think it also ties in really nicely to a question that's talking about emergency access points along trails for conflict or areas where it is needed.
I'm going to start, but just from a general viewpoint, American Trails has a series of webinars, which what I just do with them. The organization American Trails has a webinar archive. These webinars are available. One is called Reducing Crime One Trail at a Time, how trails are part of the crime solution. There is there's a crime prevention through environmental design recording. This was done in 2020. And there's a getting to a yes on greenway trails in your community. So there are several, just 3 webinars from American Trails on environmental design. That again, it was not a focus of these reports, but Jeff, do you and your team have more you can add on that?
You are correct. It was not a focus. We focused on sort of people's vulnerability associated with climate change as trail users, and I think that's incredibly valuable and is related to security, especially as Stephanie was mentioning from an education perspective, to make sure there are warnings during certain times of the year of the types of use and how long it is between trailheads and facilities, and how close other communities are to the trail itself, and and good wayfinding of where the facilities are along the route itself. So I think in that respect we do address it, but we did not dive heavily into those specific security issues like lighting, et cetera. But we certainly recognize that those are important issues, especially when working in vulnerable communities.
I'll just add that the Bear Creek Greenway is an example of a trail where the managing agency was not managing the vegetation around the trail, and that had impacts for fire. So the bigger effort around managing invasive vegetation has benefits for keeping trail, increasing sight lines and visibility. So, but again, it comes down to maintenance, right? Agencies have limitations around resource, staffing and just man hours, person hours, and there's always a cost to all these things. So.
Yeah. All right. Next, I think I'll move on to a question that I think, Todd, is a pretty good one for you, especially after the poll question discussing whether or not certain localities had plans in place for emergency management as a part of trail maintenance. Someone asked what department would be best to contact regarding funding trails as potential emergency response infrastructure evacuation routes.
I think you'd want to start with whoever does your emergency management planning, and that may be a federal or a state agency, or it could be a local agency, police, fire, if there's any type of like emergency just your local emergency management group would be the place to start.
Yeah. All right.
I can add-
Christopher, did you
Oh,
want
yeah,
to-
yeah.
Yeah, again, I'll put this, I'm going to answer this in the Q&A pod, but we have Federal Highway Administration, we have our pedestrian and bicycle funding opportunities table, which includes the whole laundry list of it shows multiple U.S. Department of Transportation programs that can fund multiple kinds of pedestrian and bicycle projects. It includes emergency stuff. It includes any kind of pedestrian, bicycle, or trail project that you could think of. It's included in that list, and it's not an exclusive list, but it's a good list that you could use. So I put that in the chat, and that will be made available. Kristen will make that available at the end of the webinar.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think next we have time for maybe one or two questions here before we have to wrap things up. But one of the ones that I'm looking at right now is we received a few questions about integrating trails within existing facilities. Are there any key factors that y'all would look to when it comes to connecting trails to in already existing infrastructure in terms of resiliency and trails?
So I'm going to interpret that to mean like within a utility corridor or a active railroad corridor or some other linear facility that's functioning in some other way. So that it depends on what that facility is. That will dictate sort of the requirements and parameters that you need to follow in order to co-locate a trail. For example, I think Christopher mentioned earlier that there's now a study going on looking at sort of the design and engineering qualities necessary for incorporating trails within active rail corridors. So there's obviously a lot of environmental issues and permitting issues that are associated with that within that active corridor. So again, we don't sort of get into that nitty-gritty detail in the guidebook, but certainly lay out sort of what the larger issues are going to be related to permitting. So I don't know if Stephanie or Kristen, if you want to add to that.
I would add that trails are really like the ultimate multifunctional infrastructure. They can do so many things, and they often share space with utilities. Because they're linear, right? They can be parks, they can be linear parks, they can be, transportation, they can be recreation. So I think it's an opportunity, and thinking about the ways that that trails can meet a community's real resiliency needs. There's just a lot of opportunity there, more than constraints, I would say.
Sorry, so Stephanie, think about stream valleys, because I think, you know, I think that's a common place of co-location that has sort of carries with it a lot of permitting and environmental concerns. So I think when you are trying to position a trail within a stream valley, you have to look to your local and state and federal guidance in terms of the permitting associated with that. That's really going to dictate sort of where and how you can position and implement that trail moving forward. So again, the facility you're trying to co-locate or the land you're trying to use will dictate sort of what you need to do in order to get that thing built.
Perfect. And then I think one nice last quick question. Or do you all have any insights on how to access or interpret volume data on how much traffic goes through trails and how to move forward in that effort?
On some projects I've been working on, we use automated trail counters that are placed out for often a couple weeks, few weeks to cover different types of weather, avoid holidays, things like that. You can use those to extrapolate trail use across a particular season, or use them in different seasons to gather trail use for the year. Or there are trails that just maintain trail counters the entire year and even feature them in signs. We've also conducted, and we actually did this for e-bikes on a trail in Boston, just manual trail counts. And in that case, we were counting only wheeled users, but every wheeled user, to see how great the proportion of e-bikes to other kinds of wheeled uses was. And so yeah, you can actually, that takes labor, then that does take plenty of staff just to keep their attention going and not overwork anybody. But these are really pretty easy things to set up, and there's some pretty low cost trail counters out there. I think Eco Counter is a big one that I've heard about a lot.
Perfect. All right. Well, I appreciate it. It looks like that is all the time we have for today. I want to take a second to thank all of our panelists for coming and sharing out with us. I also want to thank everyone for joining us. It's been an insightful and really awesome presentation. I just want everyone to keep an eye out for the follow-up email that I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. It's going to have all the details relating our webinar archive, our post-webinar survey, webinar materials, and then professional development credits as well. We hope to see you with our next webinar, and hope you guys all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.